For 1916, the military leaders decided to go bigger. Bigger offensives, bigger weapons, harsher discipline, deeper mobilization of societies. But back home, the war had brought nothing but mass death and misery, and now food prices were surging, and as millions flocked to industrial centers to take part in the war economy, landlords used the opportunity to sharply increase rents. And while everything sucked for the average civilian, industrialists, landlords, and financiers accumulated immense wealth from war contracts and speculation. What was supposed to be an emergency sacrifice for the good of the nation increasingly appeared as organized exploitation. Daily struggles over bread, rent, and fuel politicized millions who had never been active before, especially women. And with official trade unions committed to the war effort and refusing to act, workers were forced to organize outside official channels as class consciousness slowly began to reappear. Between 1915 and 1917, strikes increased sharply across Europe, many now led by women. In the Glasgow rent strike of 1915, mass resistance to evictions forced the British government to introduce rent controls nationwide. Glasgow would become a major center of wartime resistance, later known as Red Clydeside. Some soldiers were also starting to resist. They deserted, insubordinated, and mutinied, despite the extreme risks involved. On the Eastern Front, Russian forces finally stabilized their lines after months of retreat, but at a staggering human cost. On January 6, 1916, Montenegro surrendered to the Central Powers, and soon after, Russian forces captured Erzurum and the port of Trebizond. In February, the final German colony in Africa fell to the Allies. As British soldiers were now dying faster than they were enlisting, Britain introduced conscription, and Portugal entered the war on the side of the Allies. On February 21st, Germany launched a massive assault on the French fortress city of Verdun, intending to cause enough casualties to bleed France dry. For nearly 300 days, hundreds of thousands died at Verdun for literally no gain, shattering any remaining illusion that sacrifice had any meaning. To relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, Russia launched an offensive at Lake Narok, which ended in disaster. In April, Irish Republicans and Socialists rose in Dublin in the Easter Rising, the first explicitly political revolt against the war and for Irish independence. The rebellion was crushed after 6 days of street fighting. British forces surrendered at Kut by the end of April, and the British promised Arab leaders independence in exchange for revolt against the Ottomans. But they also secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement with France, dividing the region between themselves. Sharif Hussein bin Ali launched the Arab Revolt, which you can learn more about in my Lawrence of Arabia video, which may or may not be getting a remake eventually, wink wink. The British and German fleets finally clashed at Jutland. But the dreadnought ships were so incredibly expensive that no side dared risk them again, so they avoided each other for the rest of the war. Now, if you're a history nerd like me, you may wonder what would have happened if they had indeed fought. Would Germany have beaten Britain? Could they have turned the war around? Or would Britain have defeated Germany? While we may never know for certain, you can simulate it yourself by playing World of Warships, today's sponsor. World of Warships is a massive multiplayer online game that allows you to command a massive naval fleet and relive some of history's most pivotal moments on the seas. Their ships are designed to be hyper-accurate and as close as it gets to the real thing. And since this year is the US's 250th birthday, they are launching a special event from June 17th to July 15, where you can experience the history of the US Navy by playing with real ships on real harbors and real port towns. If you're a history nerd like me, you should check out World of Warships either by yourself or with friends. And if you use the code USA250, you will get 1,000,000 credits, 7 days premium time, a bunch of doubloons, and some pretty cool ships. So sign in now using my link in the description. And also check out their cool book Naval Legends Cruiser for some amazing pictures, maps, and illustrations. Meanwhile, Italy came under pressure at Asiago, and the Allies coordinated a summer offensive to relieve pressure. Russia struck first, forcing the Central Powers to redeploy troops under heavy losses. The British and French followed with a massive offensive on the Somme, where the British forces suffered 57,000 casualties in a few hours, almost 20,000 dead. When discussing World War I, casualties are so high that it's easy to lose sight of their humanity and just think of them as statistics. But each one of these was a person, with dreams, ambitions, and people waiting for them at home. 20,000 died in a few hours. Meanwhile, the people responsible for the war sat comfortably far from the front lines. And still, the offensive continued for 5 months. Machine guns, artillery, and fortified defenses tore through wave after wave of young men, no different from you, your brother, your father, or your son. Sir, I'm afraid winter has come and no man's land is impassable. The trenches are collapsed and we can't even serve artillery. We took 600,000 casualties and the Germans only 400,000. What a disaster! 600,000 to 400,000, you say? Why, that's great news! There are more of us than there are of them. And we receive reports that the recruits are now younger or older. So this means that if we continue like this, they will run out of people first. I, a fully developed adult, have heard those words come out of your mouth, processed them, and will now devote my time to ensuring we carry that plan out. Hey Romania! Austria-Hungary is struggling against Russia. This is the time to strike and get those territories you've been dreaming of. Haha! I'm gonna show you who's— Nope! On September 15 at Flers, British forces deployed the first tanks in combat, but they were too few and unreliable to break the stalemate. US President Woodrow Wilson tried and failed to mediate peace, as neither side was willing to make concessions after so much bloodshed. The war now continued not because victory was near, but because defeat would be a political nightmare. During this time, life in the trenches was physically and psychologically horrible. Soldiers lived surrounded by mud and stagnant water, unburied corpses, and unexploded shells. They would stand for days in icy water, leading to trench foot, which often ended in infection, gangrene, or amputation. Each morning and evening, soldiers stood armed, anticipating attack. Most work, like repairing trenches, laying barbed wire, and hauling supplies, was carried out at night, so they slept very little and in horrible conditions. Rats fed on corpses and grew large and aggressive. Lice and fleas infested uniforms and skin. Diseases like dysentery, respiratory infections, tuberculosis, venereal disease, and exhaustion were rampant. Officers were generally believed when they reported illness, while enlisted men were treated with suspicion and accused of malingering. Many soldiers prayed for an injury serious enough to send them home. Under these conditions, war aims lost all meaning for most soldiers. Recovering territory, defending civilization, or achieving national glory no longer mattered. Letters, graffiti, poems, and popular songs expressed an overwhelming desire. "I want to go home." If given a choice between continuing the war or leaving immediately, even at the cost of defeat, many soldiers would have chosen to leave. Men continued fighting for 3 reasons: because desertion meant near certain execution, the fear of disgracing family or comrades, and above all, solidarity with the men beside them. Civilian morale was also collapsing, as they increasingly blamed elites and even capitalism for prolonging the conflict. As pacifism was gaining ground, authorities responded by intensifying propaganda like John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields, which transformed the voices of the dead into a moral command to continue fighting, implying that peace would betray fallen comrades. The poem became a powerful propaganda weapon, widely used for recruitment, war bonds, and later conscription. The red poppy born from this poem would become a famous symbol of remembrance, but also of militarized nationalism, so the pacifists adopted the white poppy in protest. By early 1917, German leaders realized they could not win a prolonged war of attrition, so their solution was a gamble. War crime the shit out of Britain's naval commerce and starve them into surrender before the US gets mad enough to join the war. But after the Germans sank some more American ships and even tried to get Mexico to attack the US, the United States declared war on Germany on April 6th. But it would still take months before enough American troops arrived in Europe, so Germany still hoped its submarine campaign could work. France launched the Naval offensive, but once again accomplished nothing but causing immense casualties, and French army morale collapsed. Almost 40,000 soldiers mutinied, affecting almost a third of all French divisions. They refused to go on any more suicidal attacks, mocked their officers, sank the Internationale, and demanded peace. The French High Command responded with repression, but order was only restored after General Pétain allowed for some reforms. Every major capitalist government now feared not only external defeat, but also internal collapse. Pacifist groups expanded in Germany and Britain, and the states censored and imprisoned pacifist leaders like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. But repression only produced more resistance. In Russia, food shortages were severe, medical care was inadequate, casualties were enormous, and draft resistance was spreading rapidly. And worst of all, soldiers were now even refusing to fire on civilians, which nowadays may sound reasonable, but back then was a big deal. Petrograd saw constant strikes, and every day the Tsar's authority hollowed out more. On International Working Women's Day, women textile workers launched protests over bread shortages, and 90,000 tired and hungry workers joined them on the street. They went factory to factory recruiting more. First they demanded bread, then the end of the war, and finally an end of autocracy. Railway workers blocked troop movement, and soldiers sent to suppress the revolt ended up joining them instead. The Tsarist regime, once so powerful, collapsed incredibly quickly, and the Tsar abdicated on March 2nd, 1917. Out of the February Revolution emerged a provisional government dominated by liberal Duma politicians and some moderate socialists, which competed for power with the more popular Petrograd Soviet. The provisional government was immediately recognized by the Allied powers and committed to continuing the war, which perpetuated the conditions that had caused the revolution. Still, this revolution shocked Europe. Thousands protested in London to express support, while tens of thousands of workers struck throughout Britain. Tens of thousands also marched through Glasgow supporting the Russian Revolution, and massive crowds protested to demand the release of John Macmillan, one of the leaders of the Red Clydeside movement. In the meantime, real wages in Germany had collapsed and food shortages worsened. During the turnip winter, German adults survived on a fraction of their daily caloric needs, so tens of thousands of workers struck in Berlin against the rationing. Bread protests in Leipzig led to the establishment of early attempts at workers' councils. The fall of the Tsar destroyed social democratic claims that the war was a struggle against Russian tyranny, and in April 1917, the SPD split into the independent and majority SPD. Within months, the anti-war independent SPD rivaled the majority SPD in size, although it remained politically unstable as it included diverse ideologies. The armies of Europe were now faltering everywhere. Italian soldiers deserted and insubordinated en masse after their defeat at Caporetto, while 2 million Russian soldiers deserted between February and October. Fraternization between enemies reappeared on parts of the Eastern Front, and in Germany's navy, sailors organized strikes and committees to protest conditions and class privilege. The authorities violently crushed these efforts. By the end of 1917, revolution was a real threat to every nation involved. The only question was who would fall first. The Allies were now developing new convoy tactics and better anti-submarine measures, so U-boats steadily lost effectiveness. Germany's gamble had failed. Baghdad fell to the British, and Greece's neutralist king was forced to abdicate, and it joined the Allies. Arab rebels captured Aqaba, supported by Lawrence of Arabia. The British issued the Balfour Declaration, promising a Jewish national home in Palestine to gain support for the war, in spite of earlier promises to Arab leaders. They then won an important victory in Gaza and opened a route into Palestine. In October, unhappy about the provisional government's failure to end the war and improve conditions, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia and immediately pulled Russia out of the war. With Russia gone, Romania signed an armistice, allowing Germany to focus its forces on the Western Front. Its leadership believed that the only way to achieve victory was to win before the US could enter the war in greater numbers. Germany launched its spring offensive in 1918 using stormtrooper infiltration tactics. Despite some initial breakthroughs, the offensive burned up Germany's remaining reserves and failed to secure a decisive victory. With American troops entering combat in growing numbers, Germany's fate was sealed. Austria-Hungary attempted its own offensive against Italy to assist, but was repelled at enormous cost. In August 1918, the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive, and the German front began to buckle while its allies fell. Bulgaria signed an armistice, and as the Ottoman Empire lost Megiddo, Damascus, and then Aleppo, it signed one too. Austria-Hungary suffered a crushing defeat at Vittorio Veneto. Its army collapsed, and it was also forced to sign an armistice. German military leaders admitted the situation was hopeless, so they sought an armistice through US President Wilson, who demanded withdrawal from occupied territories and political reforms that included the Kaiser's abdication, which he refused. In early November 1918, the German Naval Command ordered a suicidal attack against the British fleet. The sailors refused to sail, unwilling to waste their lives at the end of a lost war. This mutiny spread quickly, igniting strikes, protests, and uprising across the country. Within days, workers' and soldiers' councils were forming in cities and barracks throughout Germany, partially inspired by the Russian Soviets. These councils exerted immense pressure, and every German monarch, including Kaiser Wilhelm II, abdicated. On November 9, the German Republic was proclaimed, and 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, the new government signed the armistice that ended the war. But the armistice did not bring stability. Instead, it unleashed a wave of unrest that swept across Europe. Britain saw more massive strikes in key industries, soldiers and sailors mutinied, and in some areas, even the police walked out. The government responded with repression, but also some concessions. They increased wages and passed the Representation of the People Act, which dramatically expanded the electorate. Strikes resumed in France in 1918, and unrest intensified after the armistice. Admiration for Soviet Russia was sometimes expressed openly within the labor movement. But the revolutionaries had no strong leadership, and government concessions like the 8-hour workday helped diffuse tension. Austria-Hungary collapsed entirely as mutinies and revolts spread across its territories and new states emerged from its ruins. Austria saw a revolution that initially created a social democratic republic, while Hungary turned into a Soviet republic under Bela Kun, although it was soon destroyed by counter-revolutionaries. Italy emerged from the war devastated by death, inflation, and collapsing wages. During the so-called Biennio Rosso of 1919 to 1920, workers occupied factories, formed councils, and armed themselves, while peasants seized land in the countryside. But the socialist leadership and trade unions chose negotiation over a decisive bid for power, which demoralized much of the movement. The elites panicked, realizing how close they had come to being overthrown, so they looked for a way to redirect the anger of the masses elsewhere. The end of the war also failed to end Germany's crisis. The country was devastated by hunger, disease, and economic collapse. Millions of soldiers were returning home to unemployment and scarcity, while workers, radicalized by years of sacrifice, increasingly questioned the social order that had sent them to die. The old imperial elites, the military leadership, and even the SPD leaders feared that a socialist revolution might spiral out of control. So President Ebert and General Groener struck a deal. The military pledged loyalty to the new republic, while the social democratic leadership agreed to preserve the existing state apparatus and help suppress revolutionary movements. This was the birth of the Weimar Republic, a parliamentary democracy with universal suffrage, proportional representation, and significant reforms such as the 8-hour workday. Yet the councils that had driven the revolution were sidelined or dissolved. Armed paramilitary units, composed largely of former soldiers, were unleashed against revolutionary workers, crushing uprisings and murdering key socialist leaders like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Meanwhile, the old elites retained deep influence over the army, the judiciary, and the bureaucracy. At the Paris Peace Conference, the promise of democracy and self-determination was largely abandoned once negotiations began, and the victorious powers prioritized their own interests instead. Germany was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, generating deep resentment. Its colonies were taken and divided among the winners, while former Ottoman territories, especially oil-rich regions, were placed under Allied control. This post-war settlement did not end empires, it simply reshaped them. While the Great War was over, nations would still struggle with internal stability for decades, as they chose either reform or revolution. But many in the elite preferred to look for another way out, a way to redirect the anger of the masses and violently stop the attack on capitalism. This would be the rise of fascism, which would lead to World War II.